know about the ghost towns? The towns I used to live in? Good, good. Most folks nowadays don't believe in ghosts. All they believe in is facts. Give us facts, they say. My way of thinking, facts are all right, but they're poor, weak things with no power or know-how when it comes to getting men a-moving.
But dreams and hopes, those are the powerful things in men's lives.
It was dreams that built the West. Fancy dreams, but strong and real in the hearts of the settlers that built the towns and the railroads of my day. These little old towns with their streets so full of hope and pride appeared while the fever of gold swept the nation. And when our dreams faded, then our towns died too. Now most of them just taken away by the wind. These pictures we have to show you were made years ago while some of the towns were still there to see. They're the best motion picture record ever made of the ghost towns of the Old West. When you look at some of the places where we come by wagon or on a horse or maybe just afoot to find gold, well, you know the dream had to be powerful, strong. And when we look at these places that we're going to see in these moving pictures, well, they were about as mean and hard as they come. Hamilton, Nevada was the wildest town. There was a time more people were killed than died natural. Yet 30,000 people come there to mine. And in Death Valley, the water would kill you, and so would the desert heat. But we came anyway because of the gold. It's a good thing some fellas took pictures of these places while there's still something to see, because they're going fast. See for yourself.
Seems to me in eastern Nevada, the mining camps here come and went almost overnight. But a few places lasted long enough to become real smart towns. Eureka, Austin, Hamilton. They're the ones that grew and prospered from both gold and silver mines. But then, even they faded away as the mines gave out or become flooded, and once more the dream died in the ghost towns of the Great Basin.
In the heartland of the American West lies the region known as the Great Basin, a land of incredible beauty. It covers more than 100,000 miles of brilliantly colored terrain that rises in chain after chain of mountains. For 500,000 years, this land was the scene of violent change. First, a gigantic lake, later a tropical swamp, then part of the Pacific Ocean. Land and sea continually changed places until an upheaval lifted the ocean floor and created the Great Basin. The conquest of the Great Basin is told in the stories of its rich gold and silver strikes, of its booming cities, built to flourish briefly and then die, the ghost towns of the Great Basin. Mother town of eastern Nevada mining was the roaring camp at Austin, once the seat of a county that covered a third of the entire state. Established first as a remount station for the Pony Express, it was repeatedly attacked by the Indians during the early days. Later, when Western Union pushed its telegraph lines across the basin, following the trails of the Pony Riders, Austin became a maintenance station and guarded the thin wire against the savage Paiutes. In 1862, one of the wagon horses kicked loose a piece of rock, revealing a load of rich silver ore, and the city of Austin was born. On the outskirts of town is the old engine house, all that remains of the Nevada Central Railway. This end of the road was once the scene of a fantastic race against time. To obtain a $200,000 subsidy, the road had to be completed by midnight on February 9, 1880. But at noon on that day, it was still 2 miles from town. A town meeting was called, and it was voted to extend the city limits half a mile. The road crossed the new city boundary with 10 minutes to spare. From this old store in Austin came the most valuable sack of flour in history. To pay a Civil War election bet, Reuel Gridley carried the sack from his store to the city hall. There, the flour was auctioned off for the Soldiers' Relief Fund. A total of $275,000 was realized from the auction, and a picture of Gridley's sack of flour became the official city seal of Austin. Among the town's fine buildings was the International Hotel, built first in Virginia City. It was torn down piece by piece, loaded on wagons, and hauled across the Basin to Austin. An unusual sight in early days were the outside stairways. They were patterned after the drawbridges of old. Desperados roamed the streets at night, so the respectable elements simply pulled up their stairways. The store of Charles Holbrook was the Austin terminal of the camel train he operated to the outlying settlements. For many years, the beasts were a familiar sight as they plodded through the streets. The oldest newspaper in Nevada, the Reese River Reveille, occupied this building. The paper's first edition was on the streets less than 10 hours after the editor arrived in town. One of the territory's most notorious outlaws, L.B. Vail, was captured on the outskirts of Austin. Lack of a judge delayed Vail's trial until the local citizens committee grew tired of waiting. They stormed the jail, took the outlaw, and held a court of their own. The self-appointed judge assured Vail that justice would be served and he would be given a fair trial. But the proceedings of the court were frequently interrupted by the sounds of a gallows being erected outside, as well as the construction of a coffin within the courthouse itself. Nevertheless, the prisoner was deliberately and gravely tried. Found guilty, he was hanged an hour later on the newly built gallows. On the crown of a hill overlooking Austin stands the famous Stokes Castle. Many stories are told as to why Stokes built the castle. Some old-timers say it was a fortress against his enemies. Others claim it was built where he could watch his mining operations to prevent theft of his high-grade ore. At its peak, Austin was a lusty, roaring camp with 6,000 mines dotting the surrounding hills. Money was abundant, with $20 gold pieces in every pocket and no change available. But prices for food and shelter were so fantastically high that little change was needed. At one time, a handful of crackers sold for $2, and it cost $30 to shoe a horse. When the gold gave out, Austin slowly died, but not before it had secured its place in history as the mother town of the Great Basin. Tales of the silver fever and frigid winters here at Hamilton, Nevada, have been told around the world. The rich lodes were discovered when an old Indian named Silver Jim wanted to repay a past kindness and gave a prospector a rich piece of silver ore. This gift started the wildest, most concentrated stampede in the history of the Basin and brought 30,000 people storming into the city. 101 saloons operated during Hamilton's prime. Perhaps the acute shortage of water that plagued the vicinity accounts for the large number of saloons. The only available spring was miles away, and water sold for 35 cents a bucket. Hamilton was considered the most lawless town in the Great Basin and was one of the wildest towns in the West. It was said that 75 men were killed before anyone died a natural death. The stagecoach that ran between Hamilton and Austin was held up twice a week for 5 months until the aroused citizens hanged several of the outlaws. Though it is now only a shell of brick and stone, the famous Withington Hotel was once the showplace of the district. lavishly decorated rooms rented for $25 a night, and there were no vacancies. The stone to build the hotel came from England as ship's ballast and was freighted by ox cart over the Sierra Nevada mountains from San Francisco. Hamilton also became famous for the large number of salted claims. The streets were full of speculators, dressed as old prospectors who had buried large chunks of ore in worthless mines. These mines were sold to the inexperienced Easterners who flocked into the city on every stage. Before they found out they'd been cheated, the tenderfeet thought they were putting something over on the simple old prospectors. The mountains around Hamilton have yielded some of the richest silver ore ever found on Earth. Over $3 million worth was taken from the Eberhard mine in a space only 70 by 40 feet. Two of the early prospectors in the city could truthfully claim that they lived in a house of silver. During a severe winter, the two half-frozen miners hastily built a stone cabin, only to find when spring came that the stone in the walls was high-grade silver ore. They tore the cabin down and sold it to a smelting company for $75,000. Rich as some of the strikes were, they never kept pace with the frantic trading in mining stocks. Prices soared until Hamilton stocks had a listed valuation of over $100 million on the New York Stock Exchange. The end of Hamilton came almost as suddenly as the stampede that created the town. About $25 million in silver was produced, but the loads never lived up to expectations. All but a few of the miners drifted elsewhere, but those who remained insist that the greatest bonanza of all remains hidden under Hamilton, still waiting to be discovered. Before the first house was built in Eureka, an old prospector found a rich lode of silver in a nearby gully. With the age-old expression of triumph, he shouted, "Eureka! I've found it," and gave a name to a new mining camp. What he'd found were the first important lead and silver deposits in the United States. By 1880, all the trees for 40 miles around had been cut down to produce charcoal. 200,000 bushels of charcoal went from the stone ovens to the belching smelters in a single year. Conflict over the price of charcoal produced a minor war between the Burners Association and the smelting interests. Fire, the universal enemy of the mining camps, was a constant threat to Eureka, and many volunteer fire companies were established among the civic and mining groups. This old engine was the only one available, and bitter rivalry arose over which company would man it. Many fine buildings were erected during Eureka's boom years. The Colonnade Hotel was the city's finest and played host to many of the famous who toured the mining camps. The old Opera House was a music hall in the early days. Shakespearean plays and concerts were given for the miners, who often kept time in their hobnailed boots. The town newspaper, the Eureka Sentinel, had a proud boast that it never missed an edition. In the Great Fire of 1879, the Sentinel went to press, though its printers had to work under blankets soaked with water. The mines of Eureka, like the Ruby Hill, produced a steady stream of gold, silver, and lead. In 14 years, nearly $70 million worth of ore was taken from the diggings. Many of the prospectors who walked to Eureka because they couldn't afford a horse rode away as millionaires to make their mark in New York and London society. It was the luck of such men as these, the rags to riches stories, that kept the thousands of less fortunate miners struggling in the basin. From pauper to millionaire overnight was everyone's dream, and every man had an equal chance. The horizon stretched far and wide, and with courage, determination, and a lot of luck, a man could find his bonanza somewhere in the vast area called the Great Basin.
East of the Colorado River in Arizona lived the most colorful names of the gold rush times: Geronimo, Cochise, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the outlaw Clanton gang. These hombres saw to it that the mining town of Tombstone was well named. Some of these hair towns, like Tucson, they survived and grew despite the fading fortunes of the miners. But many died away, just ain't there no more. This here is the story of the ghost towns of the Arizona desert.
Of all the cities created and then abandoned in man's endless search for gold, none surpass in violent and dramatic history the notorious ghost towns of the Arizona desert. Great quantities of gold and silver were hidden in the barren mountains or parched streams of this territory. And nowhere did nature protect her treasures more fiercely. Here in this last frontier of the West was the final stand of the gunfighter, rustler, bandit, and Indian renegade. The territory's bloody history is studded with legendary names like Geronimo, Cochise, Victorio, Wyatt Earp, and Doc Holliday. In their quest of a bonanza, prospectors faced the burning desert, the badlands, death from thirst, starvation, and the most savage Indians in America, the dread Apaches. The very word Apache means the enemy, and these tribes were the cleverest, the cruelest, the last to be tamed. General George Crook, during his campaign to suppress the warrior chieftain Victorio, called them the finest light cavalry in the world. Even the names of Arizona's ghost towns reflect this constant, merciless warfare. Fort Defiance, Horse Thief Basin, Dead Man's Canyon, and Fortification Rocks. In 1877, a lone prospector named Ed Schifflin left Fort Huachuca to seek gold in the Chiricahua Mountains. His friends warned him, instead of a mine, you'll find your tombstone. But Schifflin avoided the marauding Indians and discovered one of the richest mines in the West, the Lucky Cut. Still, he hadn't forgotten his friends' warning, and he immortalized their words when he named the district Tombstone, Arizona. Few towns could have been as well named. Renegades and gunmen who had been driven out of California, Nevada, and Texas made it their headquarters. Law and order were unknown, and the sheriffs of Tombstone had the shortest life expectancy of any men on earth. This condition continued in spite of the arrival of a U.S. Marshal named Wyatt Earp. Teamed with a man of questionable character called Doc Holliday, the Marshal brought a measure of order to the town. But a powerful gang, the Clantons, protected by the local sheriff, still robbed and killed at will. The Birdcage Theater was the town's leading variety house, saloon, and gambling hall. Many of the most famous stars of the stage appeared there. By mutual agreement, a dividing line ran down the center of the theater, the Earp faction sitting on the right and the Clanton gang on the left. Acts cheered by one side were often booed by the other, which led to several shootings. However, these shootings never interrupted the entertainment for long. The Crystal Palace was the most luxurious of Tombstone's saloons. A mahogany bar was brought round the horn and cost a fortune in gold. A measure of its popularity was its boast that 8 bartenders were always on duty. Night and day, the gambling tables that lined the walls were surrounded by miners and cattlemen. Cold-eyed professional gamblers who'd been driven out of San Francisco and Virginia City dealt the cards. Ike Clanton and his men made the Crystal Palace their headquarters. Wyatt Earp gave his patronage to the Oriental Bar across the street. Both Earp and Clanton took great pains never to stand by an open window, because each respected the other's deadly aim. Near here, Wyatt Earp, single-handed, held off a mob of 300 would-be lynchers. The Russ House was an adobe boarding house run by a beloved character known only as Colonel Nellie. Colonel Nellie never turned a hungry prospector from her door. and frequently made her house into a hospital to nurse the sick and wounded. Located near the center of town is the Good Enough Mine, part of the $1 Million Stope. The passages and shafts led for miles under the surrounding countryside. In the cave-in that caused this opening, a horse and wagon were engulfed. The horse was unhurt and was finally found wandering underground in a tunnel miles away. The large ore dumps on the nearby hill are deposits from the Tough Nut Mine, one of the richest claims discovered. The Tombstone Epitaph was the town's one and only newspaper. In the days before libel suits, its editors' lives depended as much on their revolvers as on their pens. Old-timers used to say that Tombstone was the only city in the world where you could sit down to breakfast and read your own epitaph. The Can-Can restaurant was famed for its delicacies and entertainment. Hunters were maintained to keep it supplied with fresh meat. Bear, deer, and antelope steaks were always served. The trial room of the Tombstone Courthouse was the scene of many of the dramatic trials of the period. The notorious John Heath was taken from one of its cells and lynched in a courtyard for his part in the Bisbee robberies. A coroner's jury later investigated his hanging and rendered the verdict that John Heath came to his untimely end by strangulation, self-inflicted or otherwise. Most famous of Tombstone's historical sites is the livery stable known as the OK Corral. Here, the Wyatt Earp-Ike Clanton feud was settled in the most celebrated encounter between peace officer and outlaw in the history of the West. From here, Ike Clanton defied the United States Marshal to come and get him. A few old-timers still remember Wyatt Earp and his brothers walking down the street toward the corral. Within 20 seconds, 2 of the outlaws were dead, and the rest, including the bragging Ike Clanton, had surrendered. The authority of Wyatt Earp was never again challenged in Tombstone. The gunmen were buried in Boot Hill, joining the 300 others who had died with their boots on. Here in Boot Hill, Ed Schifflin, Dutch Annie, John Heath, Billy Clanton, the good and bad share a common burial ground. Silent testimony to the violence of life in early Arizona. More than $80 million in gold was taken from Tombstone during its boom, and mining is still continued on a scale. Another tribute to the town that was called Too Tough to Die. But Tombstone was not alone in its violence and lawlessness. The pueblo of Old Tucson was called a paradise for devils, and well deserved its reputation. Since its founding, Old Tucson's history was a continual battle for survival against the Apache, Puma, and Mojave. For over 150 years, the old fort was an isolated outpost buried deep in hostile country. Hundreds died in Indian attacks, and more hundreds simply disappeared, picked off by the cunning Apaches who constantly lurked near the outskirts of town. The West's only Civil War battle was fought near here when the South sent a Texas detachment to capture Tucson. Bitter fighting ensued before the detachment was beaten back by the California volunteers. Later, Tucson became a great supply center for the string of forts used in the campaigns against the Indians. Just to the south of Old Tucson is the beautiful mission of San Xavier del Sac, oldest mission in North America. For over 250 years, the Jesuit and Franciscan fathers taught and ministered to the local Indians. Time and again, the good work of these fathers was undone by the cruelty of the gold seekers. Ghost towns are nothing new to the Arizona desert. The ancient ruins of some of the abandoned Indian cities were old in the Middle Ages. Long before America was ever discovered, there were great thriving villages in the Arizona desert. Pottery, weaving, and agriculture were highly developed arts. A network of canals brought water from the distant rivers to irrigate the barren soil. Many of these cities served as fortresses. The ladders were pulled up during an attack, and stones and arrows were shot from the roofs. As many as 10,000 families lived in the Indian tenements. Many of these cities and villages were finally abandoned due to lack of water. A severe drought lasting 23 years led to the great migration southward into the land of the Aztecs. While Arizona has some of the oldest of ghost towns, it also has the newest. The city of Jerome, perched precariously on the side of Mingus Mountain, is a city without a future. Since 1925, the entire city has been moving toward the edge of the cliff. Everywhere are braces, beams, and concrete blocks to keep the buildings from tumbling into the valley a quarter of a mile below. The foundations of the city have been so completely undermined by a honeycomb of mining tunnels and shafts that the vibration of a large truck passing over a city street could cause a cave-in that would destroy the town. It was this danger that prompted the total evacuation of Jerome. Today, Jerome joins the other ghost towns of the desert, once proud cities and monuments of the white man's conquest of the West. Now, only crumbling ruins in a sea of shifting sands. These, then, are the ghost towns of the Arizona desert.
Not all the people that come to the mining towns was miners. No, there was all kinds of people. They come to make a living, same as they did in other places. There's even a few women. Cooks. They ran boarding houses, other kind of houses. There was newspaper men and doctors and horse traders and gamblers, just to name a few. You see, in these prosperous gold towns, people had money to spend, and they wanted to spend it to make up for the harsh surroundings they was in. Here now, this part, we're going to see some of the other things they did besides digging for gold.
The production of gold dust kept this old grinder in constant use. And these scales measured the wealth of many a new millionaire. But not all of those who had come to the mining towns were miners. There were merchants, shoemakers, barbers, builders, doctors, lawyers, and Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, had advised many to go west, young man, go west. Sage advice that was taken by many an ambitious young journalist. There was no manufacturing being done west of the Alleghenies, but hand-operated printing presses were dismantled and hauled by wagon trains, by ox carts, and by riverboats until they had reached their destinations and could be put to their intended tasks by the great publishers of the future. The paper stock had to be transported from New England, and frequently the news took almost as long to reach the frontier towns as the paper on which it was eventually printed. The Civil War had been over for 6 weeks before the West knew that hostilities had ended. Naturally, the Bale of Hay Saloon, which was conveniently adjacent to the magnificent new Opera House, the cultural center for the thriving community, played host to the town's more important citizens. Done in the most elegant style, it featured a bar of solid mahogany, and its liquors and glassware had been imported from abroad. Moving picture theaters hadn't yet come into being, but the patrons of the Bale of Hay Saloon were offered a wide variety of spicy entertainment in the peep show machines. They could also learn much of the past and the future from the glamorous automatic fortune teller, or listen to the dulcet tones of the pearl-inlaid melodeon. Or, if one got tired of music, there were always games of faro or monte at fabulous stakes. A public bathhouse was one of the city's features. While the miners bathed, their clothes were even cleaned free of charge. The owner of the establishment recovered more than $100,000 in gold dust from the garments he so generously processed. Attached to the bathhouse was a barber shop, where each man of prominence had his own shaving mug. Many were richly ornamented with pure gold and silver names and fancy curlicues. But, of course, not even these rare items of male vanity could hold a candle to the goods displayed in the local emporium, which catered to milady's taste. Some of the gowns were imported from Paris and London, while others had been made in New York. But all of them followed the fashion trends discussed in Godey's Ladies' Book. The good women of Virginia City were quite aware that hoop skirts were definitely passé, and that the bustle, mutton chop sleeves, and feather boas were here to stay. High-button shoes with spike heels were hardly appropriate for the snow and slush of Montana, but then a girl had to keep in style. And look at those hats. The general store of the Old West must have been the forerunner of today's drugstore and supermarket, because it carried everything. What you didn't see, you could ask for. But you saw practically everything, displayed in the ornate windows, piled on counters, tucked in bins, stacked on the floors, and hung from the ceilings.
I bought these fancy duds I got on from one of them fancy stores, but, well, maybe that was like a few years ago.
It was about 1844 when the first white men came to Death Valley in California. Them little towns named Last Chance and Skadoo came to be, but not to stay. One town grew from 3 people to 20,000, and they all left that terrible valley in just 30 days when the gold ran out. I reckon you'll understand about that when you see the ghost towns of Death Valley.
Death Valley is the lowest point in the entire Western Hemisphere. 1/5 of its 2,000 square mile area lies below sea level. Lonely and deserted today, this arid region was once crossed and recrossed by the hurrying feet of pioneers and gold seekers. It was dotted with lawless towns and mining camps bearing hopeless names such as Last Chance, Skull Mountain, Hell's Gate, Skadoo, Dead Man's Pass, Skeleton Ditch. Even the mountains which form its wall bear the death-like name of the Funeral Range. Here, heat and death stalked hand in hand to defy those who sought their fortunes and treasures among the grassless wastes of these badlands. But the siren song of gold and silver has ever been the strongest temptation of man. And temperatures which rose to 134 degrees in the shade and 156 degrees in the sun didn't daunt the hardy souls who ventured into this area. Guided by Kit Carson, the famous Indian scout, the first party of white men entered Death Valley on their way to the Southern California coast in 1844. Some of these men, returning to the east a number of years later, brought saddlebags of shiny gold nuggets back to their homes. Clamoring men and women immediately set out on wagon trains to prospect in the Funeral and Panamint Mountains. A prospector named Shorty Harris was responsible for 2 of the most important strikes in the Death Valley region: Harrisburg, of which nothing remains, and Rhyolite, which boasts a population of 3 people. At one time, Rhyolite had a population of 20,000. It was gay, as only a mining town can be. Money was plentiful because the ore was rich. The town seldom went to bed, and along its 2 principal streets, saloons and gambling houses flourished in the gaudy style of the wild and woolly West. Rhyolite boasted a 3-story hotel, 2-story office buildings, and one of the most elaborate railroad stations in the West.
Unfortunately, the gold gave out before the railroad ever reached the town, and thus this railroad station, built at a cost of more than $150,000, never accommodated a single train. To confirm the unquenchable thirst of the citizens of Rhyolite, one man collected enough bottles to build a house, which, incidentally, is still in good condition and is occupied by one of the few remaining citizens of this famous ghost town. In those feverish gold rush days, people abandoned the town as suddenly as they settled there. And it's said that within 30 days after Rhyolite's gold gave out, most of the inhabitants had decamped, many leaving completely furnished homes behind them, some even leaving uncooked meals on their stoves. Among many interesting possessions left behind were 2,000 goats, which the citizens of Rhyolite kept pastured on the outskirts of town as their only source of fresh meat. Shorty Harris and another famous prospector are buried in these salt beds. The original marker of Dayton's grave was an old ironing board on which his name was etched with a red-hot poker. This has since been replaced by a crude headstone of natural rock. The gold strike in Death Valley was not the only reason for the traffic through this section. Great wagon trains hurrying to the gold strikes of California often followed this route because it was believed to be a shortcut from Salt Lake City. The Bennett and Arcane Party, the Jayhawkers, and hundreds of others lived only long enough to regret this misconception. Water filled with minerals and Epsom salts killed as many travelers as did starvation and unbearable heat. "280 feet below sea level, Badwater is the deepest place in the valley. The limestone formations around Badwater each year yield new skeletons of men, women, and children who died from mistaking this lethal pool for a desert oasis. Gold running $30,000 to the ton was discovered in the Skadoo claims. And while that town was in full operation, it was bawdy, violent, and lawless. Today, Skadoo is completely deserted and leaves as its most noteworthy contribution to the history of that area the fact that it was the scene of the first lynching in Death Valley. Gold was elusive in the entire region surrounding the valley. Strikes were immensely rich, but they were sparse and of short duration. Tonopah and Goldfield were heralded as the greatest discoveries in the entire world, and thousands of miners moved into Goldfield and onto the rocky slopes of the nearby hills. As immense fortunes were founded, hotels, elegant for that day, were set out in the broiling sun. And today, they are either in ruins or merely serve the tourists and the sightseers. A courthouse was built to give the city the dignity it deserved. Laws were passed decreeing that all disputes must be settled in legal fashion. But it's a matter of record that far more lasting decisions were rendered by trigger-happy miners in the sideboard saloon than those handed down in the courthouse. The First National Bank ran heavily armed stages to the mines to bring the gold to its vaults. It even petitioned the United States government to establish its own mint. But the incredibly rich veins of ore gave out as rapidly as they had been discovered. Great mining companies were then formed to bring expensive equipment across the plains and through tortuous mountain trails so that the shafts of Goldfield's mines could be sunk deeper into the earth. And more millions were spent trying to revive the Goldfield mines than were ever taken from them. Along with its gold and its silver, its boom or bust bonanzas, Death Valley produced some of the most colorful characters of that era. This is the country trod by the feet of such as the legendary Panamint Pete, Little Willie Burke, heroic figures like William Manley and the Reverend Breyer. But the most fabulous character of Death Valley by far is the man who built this castle, Walter Scott, known the world over as Death Valley Scotty. In the style of a potentate, he spent $2 million to construct his remote castle. But Scotty would never disclose the source of his vast wealth. Just a mine in the desert is the only information he would ever divulge. Prospectors, engineers, and mining men followed Scotty for almost half a century, searching salt flats, alkali marshes, caverns, and canyons, trying in vain to locate his treasure so they could stake claims nearby. All of the wealth of Death Valley was not gold. A common household product known as borax was the source of millions. In 1880, borax sold for $0.50 per pound, and the marshes of Death Valley were full of it. The only difficulty lay in the fact that Death Valley's temperature and inaccessibility made working the deposits and freighting the borax the most hazardous tasks of that day. Nevertheless, H.M. Smith and William Coleman extracted fortunes from their deposits. Smith became known as Borax Smith, the Borax King. It was he who made the 20-mule team famous. The old Harmony Borax Works was erected north of Furnace Creek. Borax from Death Valley became a symbol of drama, toil, heat, thirst, and man's determination. The brave animals of the 20-mule teams, their drivers, and the husky swampers who worked the deposits all became heroic figures of their day. But the borax crust of the valley marshes was refined and then hauled 150 miles to the nearest railroad. Today, the ghost towns and the Wind Rock formations remain as tourist attractions. Silenced are the lusty roars of the mining camps. Hushed is the braying of the mules that once freighted the borax over the burning sands. And this, then, is the story of Death Valley, the stillest place on earth, where there is no life to break the silence.
We come to the West, our heads all full of dreams of gold and silver. Dreams so big that I could hardly get my hat on. No comments needed from you, dog. Sometimes we found our gold. Most times we didn't. But we lived the great adventure of the Old West. All of us. We come and we went. And them little towns we built, they come and went too. The dream towns, I call them. the ghost towns of the Old West. And now, we two are going to be on our way. You coming, dog? Don't forget about your dreams, and don't be scared to take a chance. 'Cause then, well, just maybe you'll be the one to strike it rich. All you have to do is dig.